Most theists think that God can allow some evil as long as there's a point in him doing so. But you might be surprised to learn that some theists think that it's okay for God to allow even pointless evil. In this video, we're going to see why one theist thinks that God must allow pointless evil, and we'll explore an argument for atheism that says even if that's right, there's still too much pointless evil in the world. With me is an expert on the topic of God and pointless evil, Dr. Klaas Kraay. He's a professor of philosophy at Toronto Metropolitan University. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, and it's wonderful to meet you in person finally.
Yes, we're both at a conference right now. It's been great to meet you. So I get why theists would say that if there's a purpose to the evil in the world, God would allow it. But it's harder to understand why they would say, if there is no point to it, that God must allow it. Can you help me understand that?
Yeah, it's a very surprising idea. So the argument that I have in mind here is due to William Hasker, and he runs a kind of thought experiment as follows. So suppose the normal view is correct. The normal view, let's say, is the idea that God is going to prevent all pointless evil, okay? Lots of theists believe that, right? Hasker thinks, first of all, that if that were God's policy to prevent all pointless evil, we'd come to learn it. We'd find out. It would be such an important part of God's nature that God would want us to know it, and it would seem kind of deceptive of God to not have us believe this. So if God prevents all pointless evil, the thought goes, we would find it. So now here comes the thought experiment. Suppose we're pretty confident that all the evil that occurs in the world has a point. Okay. So suppose you see some evil that's about to happen. You some circumstance, some terrible situation that's about to happen, and you think it's evil. Ordinarily, you'd think to yourself, well, I should intervene. I should try to prevent or minimize that evil or suffering. That's your first thought. But now your second thought, given this worldview, is, but wait a minute. If that evil happens, God's going to ensure that it has a point. So should I really stop it anymore? Should I really try to minimize that evil or suffering? Perhaps not. It's going to maybe serve some greater good. So who am I to interfere? Worse yet, if you're thinking about doing some evil, performing some evil, ordinarily, you think, well, probably I shouldn't do that. But now, under this worldview, your second thought again is going to be, but wait a minute. If I do that bad thing, if I do that evil, God's going to ensure that it has a point. For example, that it serves some greater good. So pulling it all together, Hasker's thought is that if God prevents all pointless evil, we'd find out, and that this would actually be bad because it would lead our moral motivation to be undermined. We would be less motivated to act morally in the ways that we ordinarily think we should. And that's a really bad thing. God doesn't want that. And so God has to allow some pointless evil for the sake of our moral motivation, so that we not be morally demotivated. That's the picture.
An immediate objection that comes to mind is, but then it looks like that evil has a point. He has to allow this. So what does Hasker have to say about that sort of objection?
Yeah, it's an objection that immediately occurs to people. You're quite right. I actually don't think it's successful, right? So here's the idea. God needs to allow some pointless evil in order for our moral motivation to not be undermined. That's the picture. Any particular individual instance of evil or suffering is really pointless. Okay, so there's no point for any individual one of these things. But as a group or as a whole or as a set, there is a reason for it. Namely, to ensure that we're not morally demotivated. Maybe a quick analogy will help. Suppose you're at a beach and you see all these grains of sand. Is this grain of sand necessary? Well, no, of course, it would still be a beach without this grain of sand. Is that grain of sand necessary? Okay, of course not. But you need to have a bunch of grains of sand in order for there to be a beach. So the individual members aren't necessary, but enough of them have to be there to serve this purpose of there being a beach, right? That's an analogy for the pointless evil case.
Okay. Now, this atheistic argument that we have in mind, there's three steps to it. And it basically, as it's formulated, will concede to Hasker that, fine, God must even allow pointless evil. We can grant that. However, the conclusion of the argument is, well, I don't know about the conclusion, but at least it would say this: there's too much pointless evil. That the amount of it is excessive.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you lay out that argument for us?
Yeah, sure. So that's exactly right. First of all, I should say that Hasker's argument, as I set it up, is not uncontroversial, right? People certainly try to resist his argument. I've offered some ways to resist it, but for the sake of this, let's grant it. Let's grant that he's shown that God has to allow some gratuitous evil, some pointless evil. The obvious next thought is exactly what you said. Okay, fine, says the atheist. Maybe you're right. Maybe there has to be some pointless evil. But look around you. Why so much? Why is there so much? That counts against the existence of God. So the three-step argument would go sort of like this. Look, if God exists, there might be some pointless evil, but there shouldn't be way too much or excessive pointless evil. Step 2, hey, look around. There is way too much. There's more evil, more pointless evil than God needs to allow for the sake of our moral motivation. Conclusion, there is no God. So this isn't an argument from evil to atheism. It's not an argument from pointless evil to atheism. It's an argument from excessive pointless evil to atheism.
Yeah, that's really interesting that it's gone through kind of 3 different versions,
That's
and now
right.
we're at excessive pointless evil.
Yeah.
So what does Hasker have to say in response to that argument?
Yeah, so interestingly, he wants to criticize both premises of the argument. In a way, he doubles down on his thought experiment. So the first premise, remember, was if God exists, then there isn't excessive pointless evil. Here's the thought experiment he runs for us, and it's a kind of a version of the earlier thought experiment. So suppose you're someone who thinks that God has to allow some pointless evil in order for our moral motivation not to be undermined, and you think that God shouldn't allow any old amount. So there has to be kind of like the sweet spot, just enough pointless evil for the sake of our moral motivation, but not too much.
Mm-hmm.
So in ordinary everyday life, you go around and you act morally and you think to yourself, all right, if I act morally and make the right choices, maybe I'll reduce the amount of evil, pointless evil in the world to some extent. But I'm not going to bring it about that there's too little, that this zone of acceptable amount of pointless evil is not going to be kind of compromised. So ordinarily it's fine. There's no moral demotivation. But sometimes some of us are in a very special position. We're in a position of being able to do a lot of good in the world. His example here is officials making decisions about responses to pandemics. He wrote this before the COVID pandemic. But here's the idea. Suppose you're an official and you're able to bring about some wide-ranging, significant measure that's going to dramatically reduce suffering. Maybe you institute social distancing requirements, or you deliver a bunch of vaccinations, or you bring in mask mandates. If you don't like those examples, choose another one, right? An example where you're able to do a lot of good in the world. You stop and think to yourself, wait a minute. There has to be this reasonable amount of pointless evil so our moral motivation isn't undermined. If I do this thing that's going to dramatically reduce the amount of pointless evil in the world, well, now it looks like somewhere else God's going to have to allow more pointless evil so that this zone or range be filled with sort of more or less the right amount of pointless evil. The more I do this by bringing about good in the world, the more God has to allow pointless evil elsewhere. And then you think to yourself, well, now this seems crazy. Now I'm not sure I'm motivated to do this really good, wide-ranging thing anymore. It's not going to make any global difference anymore. So Hasker wants to double down and say, not only does God have to allow evil, not only does God have to allow pointless evil, God has to allow excessive pointless evil so that in these special cases, our moral motivation isn't undermined.
Now, what might be an objection to that response from Hasker?
Yeah, so I think there's a few ways you could resist that response. One easy way, I think, is to say this. Look, if everything is as Hasker thinks, here's something that God could do. God could intervene in these people, these very special people who in a few points of their lives have the ability to drastically reduce the amount of evil in the world. He would be able to kind of change their view so that their moral motivation isn't undermined, to interfere, miraculously in their brains to ensure that they still have moral motivation, that they don't kind of think through the thought experiment that I just walked you through.
Mm-hmm.
And now your first reaction might be, well, that seems like God shouldn't do that. God shouldn't mess with our minds in that way. But of course, someone might respond to say, look, it's worth it, right? Yes, ordinarily God wouldn't mess with our minds in that way. But in these cases, to ensure that these key people in these key moments in our lives aren't morally demotivated, well, then God should do that. That's one way to respond, I think, to Hasker's criticism of this premise.
Okay. Let's go ahead and move to that second premise now that, well, look around. There's all this excessive pointless evil. What does Hasker have to say in response to that?
Yeah, so he wants to resist that premise as well. And you might say, well, that's a really ambitious thing to do. So he resists it in a couple of ways. I'll just mention one. And that way is this. He says, look, if God really wants to reduce dramatically the amount of evil and suffering in the world, God's going to have to intervene miraculously in a whole bunch of ways. And he thinks that that wouldn't be a good thing. So his example is cancer in the United States, okay? So there's a lot of cancer in the United States, and for sure it causes a lot of pain and suffering. No question there. So if God wants to dramatically reduce the amount of pain and suffering due to cancer in the United States right now, as our kind of case, our test case, Hasker thinks that God would have to perform thousands upon thousands upon thousands of miracles to reduce the suffering of the individual cancer patients in an overall significant way. Now, God could, of course, do that. But here's the problem. If God does that, then the laws of nature are going to be compromised. The ordinary consequences of cancer are going to be thwarted by God. So nature is going to be less regular, less predictable, and so we're going to be less able to understand nature. And Hasker thinks that's actually a problem, right? It's important for us to be able to do science and to think through the natural world, that the laws of nature operate more or less in a regular way. If God's constantly intervening all the time, the laws of nature aren't going to be regular. That's a bad thing. And they're not going to be as easily intelligible to us. And that's a bad thing as well. So that's how Hasker tries to respond to that premise in the argument.
What's an objection to Hasker at this point?
Yeah, so this isn't really my objection. It's an old idea. Certainly it's expressed by David Hume in his dialogues concerning natural religion. And the response, and I think it's a good one really, is that it's just a mistake to think that God would have to, even in the case of cancer in the US today, perform thousands upon thousands of miracles in order to dramatically reduce the amount of suffering. I mean, here's something God could do instead. God could intervene rarely and surreptitiously in significant ways on a few key occasions, maybe, for example, by giving cancer researchers just a little more stamina when they're working late in the lab one night, just a little more fortitude, just a little more clarity of thought and understanding. Help the scientific conferences about cancer treatments to go a little bit more smoothly. Little things like that, little tweaks could have a dramatic effect on helping cancer researchers to discover ways to minimize the suffering or to prevent cancer or what have you. So it's a mistake to think that God would have to do thousands of special miracles for each individual sufferer that would be detectable and would compromise our understanding of nature. Instead, God could just intervene in a few key ways here and there to dramatically reduce the amount of suffering. So I don't think that Hasker's objection to this premise succeeds. So for all we've seen so far, this looks like it's a pretty strong argument for atheism from excessive, pointless evil.
Mm-hmm. Now, the viewer might be like, especially if the viewer's a theist, which many of my viewers will be, they might be like, okay, so then what is a good response to this argument? And for that, you mentioned in the paper, there's a different sort of strategy. You only hint at it, but you say there's a different sort of strategy to addressing this, and that is skeptical theism. So if you're interested in skeptical theism and you want to check that out, watch my video right here with Dr. Justin McBrayer. He looks at some objections and responds to those objections to skeptical theism.